Zimbabwe. This is a $100 trillion bill. It was real money. And at its peak, it couldn't buy you a loaf of bread. In 1980, Zimbabwe was called the breadbasket of Africa, and its currency traded roughly 1-to-1 with the US dollar. Then the government ran out of money. A costly war in the Congo drained the treasury, and a land reform program destroyed the farms that fed the country. With no taxes coming in and no one left to lend to it, the government did what every collapsing country eventually does. It printed. Once you print to pay your bills, the math turns exponential. By November 2008, according to the Cato Institute, prices were doubling roughly every 24 hours. The government kept adding zeros to the banknotes to keep up until it printed that $100 trillion note, the highest denomination of currency in human history. In 2009, Zimbabwe gave up and switched to the US dollar. The trillion-dollar bills became souvenirs, worth more as a curiosity than they ever were as money. Argentina. Argentina has gone broke so many times that economists have lost count. The most famous time, it burned through 5 presidents in 2 weeks. For most of the 1990s, Argentina locked its peso to the US dollar, 1-to-1 by law. It killed the country's old inflation problem. But it also meant Argentina couldn't control its own money. When recession hit, it couldn't devalue its way out, and its debts became impossible. In December 2001, to stop a bank run, the government froze everyone's accounts, limiting withdrawals to about $250 a week. The country exploded. Riots killed dozens. The president fled the roof of the presidential palace by helicopter as crowds surged below. Argentina defaulted on around $100 billion, the largest sovereign default the world had ever seen at that point. Here's the part that should tell you something. This wasn't the first time, and it wasn't the last. Argentina has defaulted on its debt 9 times, the most recent in 2020. Weimar, Germany. In 1914, you could buy a US dollar for about 4 German marks. 9 years later, that same dollar cost 4 trillion marks. Germany lost the First World War, and the Treaty of Versailles handed it a bill it could never pay. Reparations in gold that dwarfed the economy. So Germany printed money to buy the foreign currency it owed. In 1923, France invaded Germany's industrial heartland to seize payment directly, and the government paid millions of striking workers with freshly printed cash. The presses never stopped. What followed became the textbook case of hyperinflation. Workers were paid twice a day to spend their wages before they lost value by evening. People burned banknotes in their stoves because the money was cheaper than the firewood it could buy. A new currency finally stopped it, almost overnight. But the damage was done, and many historians draw a straight line from the ruin of those years to the man who exploited it. Adolf Hitler's first grab for power came in the streets of Munich in November 1923, at the peak of the chaos, Russia. In 1998, the country that had spent the Cold War as America's great rival did something the Soviet Union never did in 70 years. It went bankrupt, and it nearly took Wall Street down with it. 7 years after the Soviet collapse, Russia was broke, plugging a huge deficit with short-term bonds at enormous interest rates. When oil prices crashed and panic spread from Asia, the scheme fell apart. In August 1998, Russia defaulted on around $40 billion of its own debt and let the ruble collapse, wiping out Russian savings for the second time in a decade. Then came the twist that hit home in America. A huge U.S. hedge fund called Long-Term Capital Management, run by Nobel Prize winners, had bet enormous sums that a country like Russia would never default. When Russia did, the fund lost billions in weeks, and the Federal Reserve had to organize a bank rescue. The Soviet Union survived 70 years without formally going broke. Capitalist Russia managed it in 7, and reached across the ocean to nearly break the richest banks in New York. Venezuela. Venezuela sits on the largest oil reserves on the planet. Its people ended up weighing their cash by the kilo because it wasn't worth counting. This was once the richest country in Latin America, floating on an ocean of oil. But the government built everything on that single resource and spent far beyond what even oil could sustain. When prices collapsed in 2014, there was nothing underneath. And so once again, the government printed, and once again, the math turned exponential. By 2018, the International Monetary Fund estimated Venezuela's inflation was heading toward 1 million%. The currency lost so much value that shopkeepers stopped counting bills and started weighing them on scales. The economy shrank by more than 3/4, the worst collapse of a country not at war in half a century. Nearly 8 million people simply left. Venezuela had the oil, it had the potential. What it printed instead was proof that the richest resource on earth is worth nothing next to a printing press. Iceland. Iceland is a nation of about 300,000 people. In 2008, its banks owed the world 10 times the entire country's economy. For centuries, Iceland lived off fish. Then in the 2000s, it discovered banking. Its three main banks borrowed cheaply from around the world and ballooned to a size that made no sense for such a tiny nation. At their peak, their debts were roughly 10 times everything Iceland produced in a year. A minnow that had swallowed a whale. When global credit markets froze in 2008, the banks couldn't refinance, and all three collapsed within a single week. The currency crashed. And then something strange happened. Britain used its anti-terrorism laws to freeze Icelandic assets, briefly listing the tiny Nordic democracy alongside terrorist organizations. But Iceland did the opposite of everyone else in 2008. It refused to save the banks. It let them fail. And it did something no other country dared to do. It put its bankers on trial and sent dozens of them to prison. Greece. In 2015, Greece became the first developed country in history to default to the International Monetary Fund. For 3 weeks, an entire European nation could take only 60 euros a day out of the bank. When Greece joined the euro, it borrowed as cheaply as Germany and borrowed enormously, hiding the true size of its deficit. When the truth came out in 2009, lenders panicked and Greece was trapped. Using the euro, it couldn't print money or devalue. Every bit of the adjustment came out of the people through years of brutal austerity. And it still took the largest bailout in history, nearly 300 billion euros, just to stay afloat. In the summer of 2015, the banks shut their doors and the government held a referendum asking whether to accept more austerity. The people voted no, and the government accepted the austerity anyway, because the alternative was worse. Greece survived inside the euro, still buried under debt. It's the modern lesson of this whole list. Sometimes the trap isn't printing too much money. It's not being able to print any at all. In Spain, every country on this list thought it was the exception. So did the richest empire the world had ever seen, which was also the very first nation in history to go bankrupt. In 1557, Spain ruled an empire so vast the sun never set on it, and treasure fleets carried New World silver straight into the royal accounts. But King Philip II was fighting endless wars on every front, and no amount of silver could keep up. The crown was spending money it did not have, borrowed against silver that hadn't even arrived. So in 1557, the most powerful ruler alive did what a broke government in Zimbabwe or Argentina would do centuries later. He stopped paying. It was the first sovereign default in recorded history, and Philip would do it 3 more times before he died. 4 defaults by the richest man in the world. That's the pattern that outlives every empire, every currency, and every century on this list. It doesn't matter how much silver is coming or how big your army is or how sure you are that you're different. Spend more than you have for long enough, and the richest empire on earth ends up exactly where the $1 trillion bill did. Countries aren't the only ones who spend more than they have.